Blake Nestle. Perhaps you've seen the recent episode wherein former recording artist Nick Cannon went on a rant that wouldn't have been too out of place on the front page of the Daily Stormer. Perhaps you've also seen how actor Terry Crews was lambasted for a tweet calling for unity. Are you worried about the seeming establishment of an ideological orthodoxy around ethnicity/race and a litany of other subjects? Does the attempt at Orwellian redefinition of terms regarding the concept of racism concern you? Prominent societal figures sign a letter condemning cancel culture and are in turn targeted for cancellation. The only moderate voice at the New York Times resigns, citing an ideologically hostile environment as the primary reason. Do all of these occurrences and their implications on practically all discourse not terrify you? How can we find beneficial solutions if a massive chunk of America is gaslit into having the tough conversations, then societally ruined for any dissenting opinion? Okay, thanks, Blake, for the rundown on this. And, obviously there are a lot of opinions all over the spectrum on these issues. And there isn't really, and a lot of the questions you're asking me here are not right, wrong, fact, versus fact type of answers. Although people with very strong opinions about these things, myself included, will stand by their principles or morality or the worldview, which is really an amalgamation or collection of a lot of different factors. And they will take their positions based on their own experience of things and decide whether this is a calamity in the making or whether this is just business as usual and the usual give and take of the diversity of marketplace of ideas that we have now so firmly established and so loudly established on social media, which is, kind of now everybody's sort of id is right there in the public eye, at least as far as people who are contributing to offering up their comments and ideas and opinions about things. Do I think it's, sort of an end of the world scenario where we're seeing the end of free speech? No, I don't think that at all. I really, really don't. In fact, the fact that we're still debating all of this so hotly, that the pendulum is swinging back and forth because it swung toward cancel culture and the desire to take people out who are not producing right think and right speech. That pendulum is swinging back the other direction now to the point that that's now being seriously called into question at the highest levels of intelligentsia and academia now. And that's to be expected. It's a pendulum that swings back and forth in our society as things trend in different directions. This is something we've been debating and talking about for literally centuries. I mean, you can go all the way back to John Stuart Mill's classic treatise on free speech, which is called On Liberty, and an amazing piece of work, which anybody who's interested in this topic really must read, because it's sort of the foundational text for modern, Western thinking on free speech. And anyway, I'm not going to answer this with a whole huge, my own treatise on free speech. I'm just going to say that it's because of the fact to me that it's still a topic of hot debate and flying attitudes as expressed all over the spectrum. I think that this is still a totally hot issue, and that means that freedom of speech is still hot and heavy, and we've all got the right and are still using it. And yes, different platforms we run into every day that have, questions and consequences and concerns. And free speech does have consequences, by the way. You're not going to be free from cancel culture of some kind. In other words, consequences. But those consequences can be taken too far. And I think that's the protest that we're seeing from the bulk of society now. And that's a good thing, and this is, again, to be expected in the push and pull and give and take of things. Now, the Nick Cannon thing, I wanted to bring this up also for another reason entirely. And I thought this was kind of interesting. If you guys don't know about this, I'm not going to do a whole rundown on it here, except to say Nick Cannon is a rapper and actor and artist, and he had a podcast or has a podcast. I think Viacom fired him now. Although he's still got work and he's got a talk show that's been pushed forward a year, I think, to give time for things to cool down. But it's kind of interesting. If you pay close attention to this or look into it at all and know what I have said in the past about the Nation of Islam, This is where things get interesting, and where it kind of comes into my wheelhouse, because I don't, up until this week, Nick Cannon to me was a comedian and host of stupid shows, and some guy who used to be married to Mariah Carey. I didn't really know anything else about him. And then this thing comes up where he does this podcast, and he is basically repeating the ideology, the thinking of the Nation of Islam. And I immediately went, what is this? He was talking about, if I might interpret rather than requote everything he said, like I said, I don't want to do a whole huge thing on this. I just want to say that him pointing out that the Jews are not the true Semitic people, that the black people are. That was his assertion on his podcast. This was taken as grossly anti-Semitic, and I get it. And from, certainly from the position of the people who have been calling themselves, Semitic for centuries now, I could see why there would be a problem there. But the Nation of Islam philosophy, if we go back to my podcast on that and go into their mythology, they believe that they are the true Semites, and there's a lot more to their litany than that. But this is Farrakhan talk. And I thought to myself, has Nick Cannon has he joined the Nation of Islam? Is that what's happening here? Because apparently this is now coming up as a bit of a thing, that there are black artists who are speaking up in this sort of what's perceived as this anti-Semitic, disgusting way. Well, turns out, according to an article I found on the Daily Beast from just 3 days ago, we're talking about Ice Cube, Nick Cannon, Diddy, the Jacksons, Stephen and Deshaun, and even beloved black author Alice Walker have spouted age-old anti-Semitic talking points, usually by quoting known bigot Louis Farrakhan. Okay. And if you don't know who Louis Farrakhan is, he's the head of or leader of the Nation of Islam, the black religious group that is partnered with the Church of Scientology. Okay. This is like so crazy how this circles around to me, right? I mean, talk about, 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon. So on his podcast, Cannon spoke to fellow anti-Semitic conspiracist Professor Giff, formerly of Public Enemy. And this guy, Professor Giff, was kicked out of Public Enemy and then got back in because he was spouting this anti-Jewish stuff. And he agreed with Giff's racist view that Jewish people control media and claiming that Semitic people are black people, so black people cannot also be anti-Semitic. Okay? Now Nick Cannon was dropped by Viacom for his comments. And some football player tweeted out some defense or something and quoted Farrakhan and got in trouble about this too. Yeah. Okay. So I then Googled Nation of Islam connection, right? Other than quoting Farrakhan, not only is Nick Cannon quoting him, he's actually been attending Farrakhan's speeches in person. There was a 4th of July speech this year, okay? This is a report from 3 days ago, and it says several prominent black celebrities attended anti-Semitic Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan's July 4th public address. And that includes Nick Cannon and former NBA basketball player Stephen Jackson, both of whom has been criticized in the past week for making anti-Semitic comments or statements. So where do you think they were indoctrinated into thinking that the Jews are the bad guys and that the blacks are the true Semites and they'll be talking about Jacob next. This is all Nation of Islam rhetoric, and this is Louis Farrakhan. So if you're wondering why I'm so strident sometimes about cultic thinking and how it can infect our environment and affect our airwaves and infect our minds, these are the kind of connections that I come across all the time. So I thought this might be overlong, and I might be getting into, whatever, that some things you guys might not be interested in, but I found it fascinating that the dots connected so immediately and so quickly. Because I had no idea, like I said, anything about Nick Cannon just a few days ago, and I certainly didn't know that he'd been attending events with Louis Farrakhan. I mean, Nick Cannon could be joining Scientology tomorrow, guys. I mean, it's that stupid and silly, these connections and how this actually works. These are dots that do connect. This isn't weird conspiracy theory stuff. So, is Ice Cube going to become a Scientologist? Maybe. I mean, these are, pretty wild, right? Anyway, so thought you guys might find that interesting. I sure did. And as for Blake, as far as I know you're very concerned about these things, and honestly, so am I, which is why I speak about them on my podcast and on my shows. How can we find beneficial solutions, you ask, if a massive chunk of America is gaslit into having the tough conversations and then societally ruined for expressing their opinions? That is true. If that were the case, then we would be having much tougher issues. What we have is we have different levels of victimization going on at the hands of the media or social media and social media mobs. Some people's lives have truly been upended, and they have had to hit the reset button in an extremely significant way because of Twitter mobs. That's a fact. J.K. Rowling is not going to be one of those people. She's not in that list. Just because she gets a lot of pushback against something that she's saying on transgender issues doesn't mean that she's being canceled. And this is where we get the hyperbole of the masses that also enters into this, which is why, and the sort of fluidity of these terms, and why societal trends are constantly morphing and changing right in front of our eyes, literally as we're talking about them. So I can say something about this right now that's true for a certain level of this, but wouldn't be true, and therefore you guys could find examples and go, well, that's not true because of blah, blah, blah. And I'd have to say, well, those are true examples that are true at a different level. You see, there's different levels to it. So you have the J.K. Rowling level where she's not being canceled. And then you have the Brett Weinstein level where he was, gotten rid of out of Evergreen College, State College, through public protest, through the mobs. And that's what happened to him, right? And there are others who have lost their jobs, lost their livelihood through, mob action. So we can go to that level and say, yes, that happened. And then we can go to these other levels where people are saying that's what's happening, but it's not really the same thing at all. You see what I mean? So there, this is what I mean by levels or the spectrums of this. So given that being the case, and the fact that society's changing its attitudes as we progress through time, I think what we're seeing is what I described earlier as this pendulum swinging of trends, and we're seeing the pendulum swing against the Twitter mob mentality now, whereas it used to be all in on that, until people kind of got their head on straight and realized that mobs don't think well, and that the consequences of mob mentality is always uniformly destructive. So not so good, right? And those are some comments on that. I hope I'm offering some food for thought more so than trying to give you a definitive answer of this is how it is, because I'm not Rush Limbaugh. And I'm not Cenk Yeager or Yinger. I'm just, I want you guys to think as much as I'm thinking about this stuff. And I hope I'm partially succeeding in doing that and giving you this answer. Thanks for asking, Blake.